Picture the most profound, staggering military humiliation of the 21st century. It does not involve massive nuclear arsenals. It does not involve apocalyptic clashes between global superpowers. And it does not involve the total destruction of entire cities. It is a quiet, devastating, and absolutely absolute humiliation that took place under the blistering sun of the West African Sahel. Imagine the highly decorated generals sitting in the luxurious, gilded halls of the Elysee Palace in Paris. Men who command billion-dollar military budgets, advanced fighter jets, and elite special forces networks spanning the globe. Imagine these powerful men being forced to sit in stunned, absolute silence as they realize they have been completely, irreversibly outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and publicly expelled by a 34-year-old African captain commanding a fraction of their budget and wielding the sheer, unyielding willpower of his ancestors. While for over a century, the French military presence in West Africa was considered a permanent, immovable law of nature. It was the ultimate, heavily armed insurance policy for the continuation of the neo-colonial empire. They built sprawling, highly fortified military bases deep in the sovereign territories of nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. They deployed their supersonic Mirage jets to rip through the African skies, and they flew their heavily armored attack helicopters over sovereign African villages, and they marched their heavily armed legionnaires through the red dust, all under the grand, self-righteous, and utterly hypocritical banner of fighting global terrorism and bringing stability to a troubled region. The Western mainstream media relentlessly parroted this narrative, painting the European forces as the noble, indispensable saviors of a helpless, chaotic continent. They told the world, and they aggressively conditioned the African populations to believe that without the permanent guiding hand of the French military, the entire Sahel would instantly collapse into the Stone Age. They sold a terrifying illusion that the African soldier was inherently incapable of defending his own homeland, that the African general was corrupt and incompetent, and that the only thing standing between the citizens of Ouagadougou and total annihilation was the benevolence of the French Republic. Whilst it was a brilliant, dark, and deeply cynical psychological operation designed to engineer absolute dependency. Because as long as an African nation relies on a European army for its physical survival, that nation can never truly be free to dictate its own economic policies, control its own natural resources, or forge its own geopolitical destiny. The military base was the modern equivalent of the colonial fortress, a looming, heavily armed threat ensuring that the political elites remained compliant and the gold continued to flow north to Paris. But as the years turned into a grueling, bloody decade, a terrifying reality began to expose the grand illusion. The heavily armed French forces, equipped with the most sophisticated surveillance satellites and elite intelligence networks on the planet, miraculously failed to stop localized insurgencies consisting of men riding cheap motorcycles. In fact, everywhere the Western armies established a footprint, the terrorism did not diminish. It expanded, it metastasized, and it grew infinitely more deadly. The violence spread like a dark, unstoppable stain across the map, burning villages to the ground and displacing millions of innocent civilians. The sprawling French military bases became isolated, hyper-secure islands of European luxury, where soldiers drank imported wine and enjoyed air conditioning, while just a few miles away, the African countryside burned to ash. The Burkinabe soldiers, the men who actually bled and died for their own soil, were treated with undisguised contempt. They were treated as junior, expendable partners in their own country, deliberately starved of real-time intelligence, forced to patrol in unarmored pickup trucks, and sent out to be slaughtered in the deep bush while the foreign jets flew safely thousands of feet above them, refusing to intervene unless it served a specific or classified French strategic interest. The African blood was cheap, and the European presence was permanent. This was the suffocating, desperate reality of Burkina Faso, until the geopolitical tectonic plates violently shifted. The illusion of Western invincibility shattered into a million pieces the very moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed the leadership of his besieged nation. Traoré was not a polished, European-educated politician who viewed warfare through the sterile, detached lens of diplomatic briefings and cocktail parties in foreign embassies. He was a hardened, seasoned combat officer who had lived in the dirt, the dust, and the blood of the front lines. He had watched his brothers in arms die in the desert because the foreign allies deliberately withheld aerial support. He had witnessed the profound, sickening hypocrisy of a system that claimed to be fighting terrorism while simultaneously treating the host nation as a conquered territory. Traoré understood a fundamental, uncompromising truth that terrified the global establishment. The French military was not failing to defeat the insurgency due to incompetence. Their failure was the very feature of the system. A permanent state of controlled chaos was the ultimate, perfect justification for their endless occupation. If they actually eradicated the terrorists, they would have no excuse to maintain their bases, control the airspace, or exert suffocating political leverage over the immense mineral wealth of the region. Traoré realized with a cold, righteous fury that the neo-colonial parasite could not be negotiated with, it could not be reasoned with, and it certainly could not be reformed. It had to be violently, surgically excised from the body of the nation. In a move of staggering, unprecedented historical audacity that sent immediate, chaotic shockwaves through the heavily guarded corridors of power in Paris, Washington, and London, Captain Traoré did the absolute unthinkable. He did not travel to the Elysee Palace to politely request a drawdown of troops. He did not issue a weak diplomatic protest to the United Nations. He looked the most powerful military force in Europe dead in the eyes and issued a non-negotiable, humiliating ultimatum. Citing the profound failure of the defense agreements and the fundamental right of Burkinabe sovereignty, Traoré gave the French military establishment exactly 1 month to pack their bags, dismantle their operations, lower their flags, and get their troops completely out of Burkina Faso. 1 month. 30 days to end a generational occupation. The reaction from the Western political and media establishment was a mixture of absolute disbelief, arrogant mockery, and deep underlying panic. The seasoned French diplomats laughed in their press conferences, but the European geopolitical analysts went on international television and confidently predicted that the young captain was merely bluffing for domestic political points. They believed, with the supreme, blinding arrogance of an empire that has never been held accountable, that Traoré would inevitably fold under the immense pressure of global isolation. They threatened to cut off financial aid. They threatened to orchestrate international condemnation, and they eagerly waited for the moment when the terrorist columns would march on the capital, forcing Traoré to publicly crawl back to them on his knees, begging for their Mirage jets and their intelligence-sharing agreements. They believed the African nation was too weak, too poor, and too terrified to survive without its colonial master. They were catastrophically, historically wrong. Captain Traoré did not blink. He did not waver. He stood like a monument carved from black obsidian and backed by the roaring, undeniable, and overwhelming support of millions of Burkinabe citizens who flooded the streets of Ouagadougou demanding their absolute liberation. The bluff was called, and the empire was found to be holding an empty hand. The countdown ticked away relentlessly, and the reality of their expulsion finally set in within the high command in Paris. The world then witnessed a spectacle that will be written about in the history books for centuries to come. But the mighty French military, the heirs to Napoleon, the self-proclaimed saviors of the Sahel, were forced to begin the humiliating process of a total, unconditional withdrawal. There was no grand ceremony. There was no victory parade. There was only the bitter, silent packing of equipment in the dead of night. Heavy transport planes landed on the tarmac of the bases they had occupied for years, loading up armored vehicles, surveillance gear, and thousands of heavily armed soldiers who had been rendered completely useless by the political will of a single African leader. The tricolor flag of France, which had flown over the territory as a constant, looming symbol of neo-colonial dominance, was quietly, unceremoniously lowered and stuffed into a duffel bag. They were not defeated by a superior foreign army. They were not driven out by a massive, bloody conventional war. They were utterly defeated and humiliated by the awakened consciousness of an African nation that simply refused to be a slave any longer. They were evicted from the premises like unwanted, parasitic tenants who had finally worn out their welcome. Imagine the sheer, unparalleled psychological liberation this event unleashed across the entire African continent. For generations, the children of Africa had been taught to view the Western military uniform with a mixture of fear and awe, and they had been programmed to believe that true power resided exclusively in the capitals of Europe. But when the footage circulated of the French convoys driving out of the bases, kicking up the red dust in their retreat, an invisible, suffocating chain was instantly snapped in the minds of millions. Traoré proved that the neo-colonial giant has feet of clay. He proved that you do not need a billion-dollar defense budget to defeat an empire. You only need absolute, uncompromising sovereignty and the courage to say no. This is why the Western media apparatus hates him with such a visceral, unhinged passion. This is why they desperately try to label his government a regime and frantically search for any excuse to delegitimize his authority. Their hatred is not rooted in a genuine concern for human rights or democratic processes. Their hatred is born of sheer, absolute terror. Because if Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation historically classified by their own biased institutions as one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth, can successfully, bloodlessly, expel a major European military power and survive, then the entire, carefully constructed matrix of global Western dominance is in mortal danger. If Traoré can successfully kick the French out of Burkina Faso, what is stopping the rest of the continent from doing the exact same thing? What happens to the global economy when the empires can no longer use their militaries to threaten, coerce, and secure the cheap flow of gold, uranium, and oil? The Western generals predicted immediate apocalypse. They promised that the moment their last plane left the runway, Ouagadougou would fall. But Traoré was already light years ahead of their predictable, racist assumptions. He did not just create a vacuum, he executed a flawless, rapid military pivot. When he immediately diversified his strategic partnerships, completely bypassing the Western arms embargoes by looking to the east to acquire the advanced combat drones and heavy weaponry that the West had always denied his country. But more importantly, he fundamentally changed the doctrine of the war. He stopped relying on foreign saviors and instead armed, trained, and mobilized the Burkinabe people themselves. He expanded the volunteers, UASHAs, for the defense of the homeland, creating an impenetrable and highly motivated national immune system. The soldiers of Burkina Faso, finally equipped with modern technology and led by a commander who actually values their lives and shares their blood, went on the offensive. They began systematically recapturing territories that the heavily armed French forces had allegedly been unable to secure for a decade. The African soldier, fighting for his own soil, his own family, and his own dignity, had proved to be infinitely more effective than the foreign mercenary fighting for a paycheck and a geopolitical agenda. The day the French military was kicked out of Burkina Faso was not just a logistical transfer of troops. It was the ultimate, definitive death of the France-Afrique military doctrine. It was the day the ghost of Thomas Sankara smiled upon the Sahel. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not just humiliate an empire. He actively, permanently restored the honor of the African warrior. When he drew a line in the unforgiving sand and declared to the entire world that the era of the foreign military base, the era of the arrogant colonial governor in a general's uniform, and the era of outsourced, dependent security is officially, irreversibly over. The African sky now belongs exclusively to the African people. The bases are empty. The empire has been humiliated, and the true, terrifying power of a fully awakened, fully unchained continent is finally being unleashed upon the world stage. If you feel the monumental weight of this historical moment, if you recognize the absolute brilliance and the righteous courage of this military expulsion, do not let the algorithms of the defeated empires bury this truth. The mainstream media will never show you the reality of their own humiliation. Hit the like button right now to force this reality into the global conversation. Share this video with anyone who still believes the myth of Western military indispensability in Africa. Subscribe to Africa Unchained, because we are not just telling you the news, we are documenting the real-time, glorious collapse of the neo-colonial world order. The bags are packed, the planes have left, and Africa is finally taking its power back.